Okay, welcome everyone to this talk. This is talk number 11 in our Ukraine series. We were hoping to stop at 10 last week, but given the fact how many amazing scholars there are working on Ukraine and related topics, we wanted to continue. And we have a very special guest tonight, Professor Gwendolyn Sasse from Berlin. She's the director of the Center for East European and International Studies. She's also the Eisenstein Professor in the Comparative Study of Democracy and Authoritarianism at Humboldt University. Previously, she was based at the University of Oxford, and she's published extensively on the topics that she will talk about tonight, namely the Crimea question. She's looked in particular on the topic of displaced persons in this context, especially DPs from the Donbas region, and also on the relationship between war and identity, on migration and other related themes. And so tonight she will talk more generally about Crimea and Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we're very looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Eva, and thank you for including me in your amazing series. I'm organizing a similar online lecture series on Ukraine at SOIS at the moment, and I think it's a necessary way to also maybe put some context and actually showcase some scholarship on Ukraine, in addition to kind of all the daily news we are following. So thank you very much. I will try to share my screen. I think it's working. And yes, I was kindly asked to talk about Crimea and Ukraine, and that's a topic that's been with me for a long time, on and off, and it is always topical again in yet another way. And what I want to do is, here we are, I couldn't move the slides for a moment. I want to start with Crimea today and work backwards. I want to, of course, focus on the annexation of Crimea. I want to also say a little bit about everyday life after annexation, and as much as we can take a little glimpse at that through survey research. And I want to then go back, and also back in time, look a bit at competing claims and how they're framed, claims to Crimea, from a Crimean Tatar, a Russian and a Ukrainian perspective. And I want to also go back to the immediate post-Soviet period, Crimea after Ukraine gained its independence in '91, when it was in fact the first big territorial post-Soviet challenge to Ukraine. But this challenge was managed, it was managed peacefully, and I think it's also useful to remember this period. And I want to also maybe offer a modest outlook in today's, obviously, very different context. For some reason, my slides are not moving very well. So let's start with Crimea today. And I think one has to start with this image, which some of you might have seen. It is a stamp that was issued by the Ukrainian Post Office in mid-April. And it shows a Ukrainian soldier showing, a border guard showing the middle finger to the Russian Black Sea Fleet cruise warship, a flagship of the Black Sea Fleet off the coast of Odessa. These border guards were stationed on Snake Island. This is a small outpost of the Black Sea coast. So this is not exactly in Crimea, but this very symbolic ship is part of the Black Sea Fleet, which is based in Crimea, in Sevastopol now. And it records this very symbolic stamp, which hundreds of thousands of them have been sold. It has become a symbol of Ukrainian defiance. And I think it also strengthens identification with that whole region in Ukraine. So this almost small symbolic act of printing a stamp and selling it, sending the stamp abroad to Ukrainians who had to flee, who support Ukraine from outside, but also to many other people, I think is a hugely important act in this war. And the incidents it records is that on the first day of the full invasion of Russia into Ukraine, a Ukrainian border guard said the following to a Russian officer on this warship, and said basically, Russian warship, go ... yourself, you can fill in the rest. And it also on the stamp, you can't see it here, it also has that writing, but it leaves out the swear word. These border guards, these soldiers were taken prisoners. They were later on exchanged in a prisoner exchange. But this moment gained even more in symbolic importance when the Moskva, the ship you see here, was sunk. And the Russian version is that there was a fire on board, and then because of stormy conditions, it sank in the Black Sea. And the Ukrainian version, which has there's much more evidence supporting this version, is that Ukrainian missiles hit this very symbolic ship. There were no stormy weather conditions in this part of the Black Sea when it happened in mid-April. So the stamp was issued after this ship had been sunk. Therefore, also its hugely symbolic importance. If we look at a map of the current developments in the war, this is a map that was published today in a German newspaper, Süddeutsche Zeitung, and I primarily included it here to get a also geographical sense of obviously where Crimea is located, but then you also see how one of the war goals Russia pursues is to secure a land corridor from occupied Crimea over eastern Ukraine. And that is partly related to water access that Crimea needs to a canal, but it also obviously blocks Ukraine's access to the Black Sea. And if Odessa were to come under Russian control, as you can see on this map, then it would be all of Ukraine's access to the Black Sea. Now, this is the current state of affairs. And I also have to say, for those of you who read German, probably all of you, it says here in the black and gray area that that's the former non-government controlled areas of the Donbas before February 24th of February this year. And it says controlled by pro-Russian separatists. I don't think that is and was a adequate description of that area even then, because without Russian military and financial support, the war in Donbass since 2014 would not have started and would not have been maintained for so long. But I put it on here because you could see you can see the up-to-date control Russian troops have gained over parts of the territory, and the fighting is currently located and concentrated in the Donbass area. I also, I don't expect you to read the Ukrainian now, although maybe some of you do. I wanted to include a recent result from an opinion poll that KIS, the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, one of the main public opinion poll institutions in Ukraine, it conducted its first opinion poll as representative as it can be under the current circumstances. On their website, you can read more about their methodology. And this was conducted in May of this year. And the question is about the willingness or lack thereof of considering giving up bits of Ukraine's territory in return for peace or negotiations, and to either secure Ukrainian independence in its current boundaries, or the alternative option is that this cannot happen. The blue option, that even if this prolongs the war, is the wording, and there are threats to Ukrainian independence, under no circumstances is the wording, can territory be given up. And as you can see clearly with 82%, the blue area here, that is by far the predominant opinion now. Of course, we don't know exactly how people think of these territories, as Crimea was annexed in 2014. We don't know for sure if people include this in here or if they mean further potential territorial losses of Ukraine or in Ukraine. But nevertheless, it shows a very strong sense of Ukraine's territorial integrity. And I read this question as including all of Ukraine, Crimea, as well as the already previously non-controlled parts of the Donbass. In this map, I just put it on because it zooms in a little more and you can see the location. You also see the strategic importance of Kerch and the Kerch Strait, which also is the way into Ukraine's ports, in particular to Mariupol, which has obviously been in the news a lot. And we've probably all followed the news about the Azovstal and the remaining Ukrainian soldiers there who had to then capitulate. And it was also a scene of war crimes in the area. But you can see here how strategically important this area is, and also the sea around it is. So the starting points really are, of course, the Russian invasion since February 24th, and the goal, one goal of many bigger goals, like destroying parts of Ukraine, eradicating the Ukrainian nation, and you've probably discussed that in many of the other lectures. But I will focus on this one goal, that it also creates this link, or could create this link, to Crimea. The annexation of Crimea into the Russian Federation, or the integration into the Russian Federation, was of course a violation of international law. Crimea has played a central role in Russian official rhetoric since then, also before, but it actually in 2014 comes out almost as a surprise at that particular moment. So this is not something that in official rhetoric was long prepared before 2014. The actual annexation and how that could be done, there were detailed plans in existence, as we found out later on. In Russia, this was popular. I'll come back to that in a moment. It increased also the popularity of Vladimir Putin. And the issue is generally considered closed. And also the Ukrainian constitution, the Russian constitution that was changed in 2020 included a new phrase that prohibits calling Ukraine's territorial integrity into question. And this is, although it doesn't mention Crimea specifically, is a clear hint that this is about Crimea. And generally, of course, both the annexation of Crimea, but also the control of parts of the Donbass weakened the Ukrainian state and was Russian leverage over Ukraine. And it also, as we now know, tested Ukraine's reaction, it tested the West's reaction, and it was a first step towards the war we're witnessing, or the even bigger war that we're witnessing now. It has brought, of course, many challenges, the annexation of Crimea for Ukraine. It has restricted access to Crimea from Ukraine and vice versa. It has brought challenges for the Crimean population. I'll come back to that in a moment. There has been outmigration, especially the Crimean Tatars have once again left Crimea. I'll come back to that historically as well. There has been a move to settle Russians, also including from the Donbass in Crimea, to change the ethnic makeup, the balance of the population in Crimea. And there has been repression in Crimea, especially, but not only, against the Crimean Tatars. And I think it's also fair to say that 2014 was a turning point in Russia-West relations. There were EU and US sanctions imposed following the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in Donbass. But as we see, it has not over time really changed Russia's political will to negotiate or to go back on any of this. So on the contrary, so the Western reaction has not stopped further Russian action. And with hindsight, it really looks like Russia tested how far it could go with annexing or attacking Ukraine or parts of Ukraine. And I mentioned the importance of the access to Ukrainian ports via the Kerch Strait. And you may also recall a violent incident, a clash in November 2018 between Ukrainian ships and Russian border guards. And of course, the question of will Crimea ever really return to Ukraine has been an open one, although of course it's not internationally recognized. De facto, there seemed to be little that could change its current status in the at least short to medium term. And now the war has somewhat changed dynamics, but the outcome is of course still very much open. I won't read out all of this, and I don't even know in the room if you can see the slides that well, but I think it's important to go back to the chronology of what actually happened in this year 2014, the annexation, because the longer it sort of moves into the past in our own memory, you sometimes also in Western reporting can find misrepresentations, and we forget, it seems, some of the details which seem quite important or which are very important. And the important starting point is the Euromaidan, the mass mobilization in Ukraine, when the then president Yanukovych didn't sign the EU association agreement. And that was the trigger. It wasn't all about the EU, it was mostly about an unpopular and corrupt president. And he was as unpopular in eastern and southern Ukraine as in the center or in western Ukraine. And these demonstrations were ultimately about Ukraine wanting to pursue a different model of state building, of politics, of economics compared to Russia. And that is why it became a danger, a risk also to Putin's Russia. And there was, although there was an internationally brokered deal with the then President Yanukovych, but he fled right after that deal was made. And the Ukrainian parliament then declared him, or declared that he had been removed from office, and it put an interim government in place, which Russia always until now calls a coup and an illegitimate government. But it is important to say that the president had left the country at that point. And then we saw in Crimea, there was no, and I think that's this point is important, there was no movement in Crimea at this point. There was one in the early 90s, but there wasn't a movement in Crimea at this point to be part of Russia, or there were no demonstrations. It started at this point, and Russia started flying its flag over Sevastopol, the port, and over Kerch. And then there were also immediate reactions, in particular, not only, but in particular by Crimean Tatars demonstrating against this. But things happened very fast, and Russia created facts on the ground. At the time, the Ukrainian army was less well established in comparison to now. And these so-called little green men from the 27th of February occupied strategic buildings and put a new so-called prime minister. Crimea has a separate status, a weak autonomy with different institutions. So it replaced the government and announced a referendum would be held. And the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council then decided quickly against a declaration of war. They realized that they would not be able to defend themselves or Crimea. And this referendum that is often referred to was then moved forward a couple of times and already happened on the 16th of March 2014. And there were only two options on the ballot. And so there were no real options, you would say. You could say one was reunification with Russia, which is the Russian way of framing reunification as it was the case in Tsarist Russia and in the Soviet Union until 1954. And it was a very complicated second option, a return to the 1992 Crimean constitution. So first of all, hardly anybody would have probably remembered exactly what that constitution said. This was the time when there were claims in Crimea in the early 90s to become independent or more autonomous from Ukraine. And there were several constitutions passed in the region at the time, And there were actually two in that year, 1992, both referred to something vague like the Republic of Crimea, but within the Ukrainian state. So it was a complicated suggestion, and it didn't go anywhere at the time, but this was now the second option on this ballot. And the official result showed massive support for reunification with Russia. 96% apparently voted in favor, turnout 83%. But we know, and we know it partly because even on an official website of the government, turnout was at some point given it as being much lower, of only 30%, is what the Russian president's own Human Rights Council said at some point, and that there was only 30 to 50% saying they wanted this so-called reunification with Russia. So it basically means we will never know the real result, and plus it was not a referendum that was held under any democratic conditions. It was held at gunpoint, so it's in this sense it doesn't tell us very much. We know from other bits of evidence that definitely the Crimean Tatars mostly did not vote or voted against, but it's not really about the figures here, but this is obviously the Russian way of presenting it, so that this became the legitimate basis for incorporation into the Russian state according to the Russian reading of the events. And then things happened very fast. On the 18th of March 2014, Putin gave one of his first really big speeches, and now we've become unfortunately quite used to them. And before February 24th, he gave several such speeches, and since then as well. But he made a big speech before the Federation Council and the Duma, and announced the reunification. And in it, he also gave one of his history lessons and justified this step, and also told the West what Russia thought of and is thinking of Western institutions, Western values, and in particular, of course, there's a lot of emphasis on NATO as well. So then Crimea is integrated into the Russian state, and already by the 24th of March, the Ukrainian army has withdrawn from Crimea. I just give you a few excerpts from that big speech, and you can also read more about this, and also all the historical references are explained if you're interested in it in a special source created together with Decoder. You can find it online. There's more information about different aspects of this annexation, but in particular, a bigger piece about the speech and what he is referring to, and what the official Russian view of history that's presented here. But he emphasizes here, as you can see, we have gathered here today in connection with an issue that is of vital historical significance to all of us. He refers to the referendum on March 16th being in full compliance with democratic procedures and international legal norms. Of course, that's not the case, but that is the argument. And I think quite important, the references that follow. Everything in Crimea speaks of our shared history and pride. This is the location of ancient Chersones, where Prince Vladimir was baptized. He refers to the spiritual feat of adopting orthodoxy. And basically, it's a place that unites the peoples of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. That is how it is presented here. He talks about Crimea as a unique blend of different peoples and cultures and traditions. He refers to a time when Crimean Tatars were treated unfairly, but then he immediately qualifies that by saying this happened to other ethnicities too. And the key sentence probably, in people's hearts and minds, Crimea has always been an inseparable part of Russia. And part of the rationale Putin gives in this speech is that the Euromaidan, that he refers to it as a coup, and the consequences would have threatened Russian speakers in Crimea. So it's about the protection, apparently, of Russian speakers in Crimea, who were not in any way at this point threatened by any of Ukraine's policies, including language policies. And he also adds, that's the bottom paragraph, that the declarations from Kyiv about Ukraine soon joining NATO, which is obviously not true either. This was not around the corner, but he asked what would this have meant for Crimea and Sevastopol. So the whole annexation is presented as a preemptive strike to prevent the negative consequences of the Euromaidan and NATO expansion as he presents it. So in Russia, what follows is that there's a rapid rise in Putin's popularity that wasn't at desperately low levels before the annexation, but had dropped significantly. And so that rose again to nearly 90%. Levada is the main independent polling agency in Russia. And this high level of popularity is maintained until at least 2018, when unpopular pension reforms are adopted. And now we have to say, as far as we can really say on the basis of opinion polls, which are very hard to conduct and interpret in authoritarian systems anyway, but then in a war context even more so. But nevertheless, we see an increase, at least in the figures again, in Putin's popularity now too during the war. So we have to add that as well. And we see, however, in a more nuanced analysis that there's a whole range of emotions that this taps into and connects to in Russian society. So if we look at Sam Green's and Graham Robertson's work, we can see that emotions like trust, hope, pride, patriotic feelings are very much tied in Russian society with this event, which also came as a surprise to elites and society in Russia. And we see a rise in this Krym nash, Crimea is ours, mobilization, and the discourse around this fits and strengthens Russian also rhetoric towards the West. It also leads to a greater militarization, including in Crimea. It brings out EU sanctions that, to this extent and with such unity, had not been imposed before. We now know that they didn't really change Russia's course of action, but nevertheless, at the time, they came as a surprise to Moscow. So I think they didn't even, when there's evidence, we know that they didn't expect that the EU could even go as far as it did. And of course, there were US sanctions as well. The costs of the Crimean annexation have been astronomical for Russia. It is the most subsidized region ahead of Dagestan and Chechnya. The figures are, even official figures, we wouldn't necessarily trust, but even they are extremely high. But we can expect that the real costs are even higher of subsidizing the population, also pensions, for example, but also supplying the region with even the basic needs, plus big projects, prestige projects like building the bridge over to Crimea, to the Russian mainland, is part of this cost factor. But nevertheless, that was never called into question, neither by the society nor by elites. The consequences for Ukraine are clear, that this has obviously undermined territorial integrity and also an international agreement, the Budapest Agreement, that was meant to safeguard this integrity in return for Ukraine giving up its Soviet-era nuclear weapons. And international guarantees were given. The US, the UK acted as guarantor states, but that did not change anything in the end, or couldn't really change Russia's course of action. And the annexation of Crimea is also the event that creates the space for Russia-backed separatists to mobilize in parts of the Donbass, and that leads, with Russian military and financial support, quickly to the war that's been going on since 2014. It has led to over 14,000 casualties up to February this year, and about 2.5 million displaced individuals, both within Ukraine and also people have left, have gone abroad elsewhere, but also to Russia. About 1 million have fled to Russia. It led to a build-up, a modernization of the Ukrainian army, and that's the army we see at the moment, defending itself with Western support, but nevertheless also a highly modernized army in comparison to 2014. It therefore changed also Ukrainian domestic priorities, and it also shifted the state rhetoric under the then President Petro Poroshenko. And although it's only picking up the story sort of at the end, his election slogan in 2019 was "Army, Language, Faith." So this was quite a narrow interpretation of what the Ukrainian state and also Ukrainian identity was or is about. And it is interesting that in these elections, the candidate who didn't really have a program, didn't have a political profile yet at all, Volodymyr Zelensky won a landslide victory in all regions of Ukraine, with one small regional exception in Galicia in Western Ukraine. And his one message, and I think that is why he is authentic now as a war leader as well, was a civic message. So including in his messages, the statement about all Ukrainian citizens, and never mind where you live, if you live in Crimea, in the parts of Donbass not controlled by Kiev, if you speak Russian, he himself was Russian speaking, but he already formulated this very civic message in this election, and that seemed to have read the mood in the population correctly. And I think that is also why he is authentic now, because that message in that sense has not changed. We've seen displacement and outmigration from Crimea, especially Crimean Tatars. And as I said already, so Russian settlement policies changing the ethnic composition of Crimea. And we tried at a time when it was still possible, from outside it wouldn't have been possible much later, to get a glimpse at least of public opinion in Crimea in 2017. And I don't want to even kind of report and talk much about the figures, how many people supported being part of Russia or not. These questions are clearly highly problematic in the context that the survey was conducted in. But if we look at more everyday life questions, then I think these types of surveys tell us quite a lot. And you can see that people have not really traveled much beyond Crimea since 2014. This is a survey was conducted in 2017. We see what I thought was shocking, that people not only physically had no access or little access, they also said that they were a lot less in touch with relatives in the rest of Ukraine. So if you say less, if you see the second bar there, less often than before in 2014, that's 44%. That's I think quite a strong statement about how ties can be cut by something like this. I mean, this is not irreversible, of course, and maybe we're seeing also partly a different dynamic now, but that is quite a drastic change. But the majority wanted, if you look at this graph, expressed their wish that that it should be easy to travel between Crimea and the rest of Ukraine. But that was not the practice, but that was the wish expressed by the population in Crimea. And if we look, this was March to May 2017 that we conducted this survey. If we look at some other questions, people did also not now start traveling, for example, to Russia a lot. So it really gives more of an image of a population really turning in on itself and being really based in the region, but not really having much access or even possibilities perhaps to travel, not even to Russia, neither the resources nor was it made particularly easy. In particular, other countries are traveled to even less. And when we look at the daily or the living conditions, people over 90% reported that prices for everyday life goods had gone up in Crimea. And you probably can't see all these options here, but we ask which of the following statements best describes the financial situation of your family, and the upper ones are all kind of having less money, having just about enough to cover daily expenses. And you can see where these bars are concentrated. So the picture we get 3 years in is that everyday life in Crimea has definitely not got better. Over time, it might have improved somewhat, but that was also the cost for the Crimean population at the time. When asked the less politically loaded question, what constitutes home for you, you see that people think very locally. They say the place where I live, over 60%, then Crimea as a region figures, but then Russia or Ukraine are not the reference points in this answer, so also not Russia. So the reorientation, I think we can have some question marks about this. So I think it's a picture that we get from these different questions of a very local population that is turned in on itself, or that had to turn in on itself. Briefly on the competing claims to Crimea, and I derive them now from, it's a little simple perhaps, from the ethnic composition of Crimea over time. And you see the figures here, it is the one region in Ukraine where there is a Russian ethnic majority, a Ukrainian minority, and an important Crimean Tatar minority, which returned after or around the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then by 2014 had become somewhat over 12% again. And you can also go back further in history, and you see the Crimean Tatar segment was in kind of over the centuries was higher, was still in the early Soviet days around a third of the population of Crimea. In the Crimean Tatar framing of the claims, and I included this Dakota essay here again, we can also look at some photographs integrated with text there to get a sense of also Crimean Tatar culture, but also called Crimean Tatar politics. They claim the status of an indigenous people in Crimea. So they are one of 3 indigenous people in Crimea. The law, the Ukrainian law that recognized their status was only passed in 2021. So we also see, so that's after annexation. So we also see that the Ukrainian state took a long time to recognize this status. So the Crimean Tatar, the Crimean Khanate predated the Russian Empire, its expansion into Crimea. I don't want to start a discussion of sort of whose historical claim, if you go back in history, that one stands over another or is more valid, but I think it's important to note different stages of Crimea's history, and to claim that Crimea has always been Russian is clearly not the case. There was a time before and there was a time after Crimea's incorporation into the Russian Tsarist Empire. The Crimean Tatars derive a lot of their identity and their claims from the experience of deportation under Stalin in 1944. They were en masse deported to Central Asia and parts of Russia. And this has built a very strong link in their identity between this particular territory and this historical experience and their national identity. And until today, and also throughout the Soviet period, interestingly enough, lots of landscape features in Crimea still carried their Crimean Tatar names. They returned en masse, or the next generation or 2 generations almost on, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. About 250,000 arrived, and that's obviously a significant number of people in a small territory. And they reclaimed land, they built settlements, they didn't wait for the Ukrainian state to approve all of this, they created those facts once they were able to do that. And they also created parallel political structures to pursue their claims of being recognized as an indigenous people and having a say in Crimean politics, and also revived in parts their language and religious traditions. The Russian version we've heard most about in recent weeks and months, and also since 2014. So the notion is, the framing is that this is the cradle of orthodoxy. The baptism of Prince Vladimir in 988 is actually not historically verified, but it's a reference point that matters a lot for the Russian framing of this. There is a perception that Crimean historiography starts with the incorporation into the Russian Empire in the 18th century, in 1783. And then there's a line of continuity drawn, as we've seen in Putin's pre-war and also post-war, now post-February 24th speeches, direct line from Russian Empire to the Soviet Union to today, and claims that derive from that. Some critical historical moments, but also literary artistic references in Russian culture are tied to Crimea, but obviously other things are tied to Crimea too, but they play a particular role in also Russian public perception. The predominance of ethnic Russians and also the Russian language in Crimea is part of this framing. And there's a discourse, of course, of the illegal transfer of Crimea in 1954 in Soviet times. It's not that straightforward, and it was also not just Khrushchev who gave it away, as it's often seen. But this is in the Russian discourse. Which was a Soviet era, not a typical Soviet era administrative border change, but this became one that was particularly important once the Soviet Union had collapsed. And there was a Russian movement, a pro-Russian movement in the early 1990s, and the Russian framing refers back to that. But interestingly enough, at the time, under President Yeltsin, in the immediate post-Soviet period, there was little support from Moscow and from Yeltsin for these pro-Russian claims in Crimea. So at the time, they generated they were powerful in Crimea, and they posed challenges to the new independent Ukrainian state, but Russia was actually not from outside pushing for these claims or trying to put more pressure on Ukraine. So that was clearly different in 2014. But also there's also a Ukrainian Crimea, and while that does not go back to, at least in some presentations it does, if you think about the Cossack sphere and the interactions between the Cossacks and the Crimean Tatars in what is southern Ukraine today. There are some references in the imperial context that Ukrainian speakers existed in what was then called Tarid, but Hrushevsky, the historian, in his mapping of Ukraine remained ambivalent about what Crimea, whether that was part of what he mapped as Ukrainian lands. And the Slav settlements increased over time, but that meant Russians and Ukrainians. I just referred to already the administrative transfer, which of course then meant that Crimea was integrated into the Soviet administrative economic structures. And by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, it is firmly integrated into many of these structures. The canal, the Dnipro Canal is one part of this. There were many links between Ukrainian Crimean Tatar dissidents and activists in particular in the Gorbachev era, but already before that. And I think one important element is that in the referendum on Ukrainian independence on the 1st of December 1991, a very important date. This precedes the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of that month. And it generates a clearer picture of societal support for independence. And although Crimea generates the lowest support level with 54% of those who voted in favor, nevertheless, it's a majority in favor of being part of an independent Ukrainian state. So I think that's an important reference point. And then there were several agreements between Russia and Ukraine, and also international actors involved in guaranteeing borders and also dividing assets like the Black Sea Fleet, for example. So I think you can say that by the mid-1990s, late 1990s, Crimea was integrated into the Ukrainian state through a complex process of constitution making at the national level. And then there's also a regional autonomy in Crimea that was implemented. And it also fits the general voting patterns of southern and eastern Ukraine. And so it doesn't stand out, except for, of course, it has a different ethnic makeup, and a very specific population like the Crimean Tatars make for a very specific also regional political landscape. I want to just very briefly, I think I need to stop any moment, but I want to briefly look at this period, which we might have forgotten a little, but I think it is important. At the time when the Soviet Union collapsed, also Western observers, and I give you the quote of The Economist here, which went a bit overboard, predicting a long-running, acrimonious, possibly bloody and conceivably nuclear dispute over Crimea. That now looks, at least with hindsight for that period, as going too far. But there were a number of risk factors for conflict, and I think they should have become obvious by now from the different claims to Crimea, the ethnic makeup, but also the extreme experience of deportation, The geographical location as a peninsula makes it maybe more conflict prone, or one can imagine conflict over it more easily. It involved strategic foreign policy issues, and there was also memory of historical Crimean autonomies, which gave rise to these movements in Crimea. And there were different overlapping conflict dimensions at the time. It was on the one hand between different ethno-political groups, but then, and I would think that is the most important one in this period, between the center and the periphery, between Crimea and Kyiv. Then, of course, between Russia and Ukraine. But in this period, although the relationship was conflictuous, it was not about Crimea's status at this point. And then a conflict centered on the Crimean Tatars, which was one of the explanations why Russia didn't push too hard for or questioning Crimea's status in Ukraine, because I think Russia at the time also did not want to engage with the potentially explosive Crimean Tatar issue. And in my book, I have explained why there was no conflict in the end in the 1990s. And I think I argue that there were different factors that helped to prevent it, like this multi-ethnicity is not a clear-cut polarization. It was ultimately a latecomer in political mobilization in the Soviet period. There was a very pragmatic approach used by the central elites in Kyiv. And there was a lack of an active external prop, namely Russia. And the key factor, I argue, was a very protected constitution-making process that lasted from 1991 to 96 for the national Ukrainian constitution, and then the Crimean constitution was adopted in 1998. So you have, from the starting point of a still created Soviet autonomy without any content in 1991, this is when the discussions start. Everywhere else, autonomy seems to be coming under pressure in this period. And here, the idea is being discussed shortly before the Soviet Union collapses. And then this negotiation over its status, in my view, helped to diffuse conflict potential, because all involved actors thought they could negotiate and get more out of it for themselves. In the end, they didn't, and the status is very weak on paper. But nevertheless, there was an article, or is an article, in the Ukrainian constitution. And on the one hand, it's a unitary state, but then there's an article talking about the autonomous Republic of Crimea. So at least symbolically, this is kind of one way of accommodating this challenge. What is less clear is, and I won't go through all of this now, is whether I'm not saying necessarily autonomy has prevented conflict. One can also say the autonomy that was weak in the end was possible because conflict was already prevented along different dimensions. But this negotiation process along the way was the way in which it was channeled, and that helped to diffuse conflict potential. In 2014, and I'll end here, the situation was quite different, and Russia was stronger domestically and internationally, and the tensions had already been rising with the West. Putin questioned post-Soviet boundaries more easily, or could do this more easily than Yeltsin, who himself had broken up some of the republics and the Soviet Union by claiming Russian sovereignty. So that's partly why he was more hesitant. And there was, however, despite on the one hand Ukraine pursuing more westward oriented policies already in this period, Crimea was also, one has to say, not a priority for Kyiv. So there was latent discontent. There was no mobilization, I repeat it again, to be part of Russian Federation, but there was latent discontent, and many have said that Kyiv had not made Crimea and also the Crimean Tatar issue enough of a priority in this period. But that, of course, doesn't justify Russian action. And the key trigger was the Euromaidan. And it is clearly an extreme case of a post-Soviet border dispute, and also post, or better, new imperial behavior on the part of the Russian Federation. And it has moved a long way from a managed territorial challenge to an abrupt annexation in 2014, when Putin used a particular moment, to now all-out war. And while there's non-recognition in the West, it looked as if this would de facto persist for a long time. But now, after February 24th, things are open again. And I sense a greater resolve in Ukraine again to not let go of any part of its territory, even Crimea, which in the earlier part of this war, or the extended war now, Zelensky had offered to negotiate or to park this issue and negotiate over other issues, but I don't see that willingness now. And I want to end with what I think are popular myths, which are very present also in Western discourse, in the public discourse, and we have to be careful when we spot those, and they are very much in line with official Russian rhetoric. And I many times hear the claim, but Crimea has always been Russian. So yes, its international law was broken, but it has always been Russian. And I think it's become clear that's not the case. That's historically not true. And plus, we can also not derive claims for today from any bit of historical legacy that we see. We also see claims that the Ukrainian state put pressure on Russians or on the Russian language in Crimea, and that Russia had to protect the Russians in Crimea. That is directly the Russian official justification, but there's no evidence for this whatsoever. So Russian was spoken in Crimea, Russian was not under pressure. This is actually one element that is also clarified in this Crimean constitution. So this argument has absolutely no basis in reality. And the local population did not demand to be part of Russia at that point. And Russia really reacted to mobilization in Crimea is another version of this. This is not true. This is the Russian presentation of it. If you look at it, there are no strong pro-Russian parties in Crimea. There are no protests happening before Russia moves in February 2014. And I will end here. Sorry, I went on a bit too long.
Thank you very much. So much for this very interesting talk and for talking us through the various economic, humanitarian, symbolic, cultural dimensions of the annexation of Crimea. And so I suggest we start with the questions from the room and perhaps then turn to the chat. We already have a couple of questions here, but I'll start with the people in the room. Oh. Unfortunately, we don't have microphones tonight, so if you speak a little louder.
Yeah,
if we can't hear you here, I will repeat the question.
Okay. I was just wondering, could you maybe tell us something about the way Russia was able to mobilize? Because at some point in your slides, I saw that Russia mobilized the Russian-speaking people in Crimea. Is that correct? And if so, how did they do this? How did these people who were not really interested in joining Russia mobilize?
Mm-hmm.
Was the question clear?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think I heard most of it. If it's not exactly on topic, please stop me. But I heard it was about how did they mobilize the local, the regional population, and I put the emphasis on the fact that there was no call from the Crimean population at the time to be part of Russia. No, that happened in parts in the early 1990s. But once Russia basically moved into Crimea in 2014, they managed to mobilize the population. And yes, to some extent, that remains a bit of a puzzle why that was possible so quickly. And I mean, you can stage quite a lot and you can use different means to stage demonstrations, but I think we should also not sort of jump the other way and say nobody wanted it. So I think it became a possibility in that moment, and it connected with a latent discontent and still a strong sense of that historically, at least among ethnic Russians in Crimea, that historically Crimea was very important for Russia, and that is kind of a close association you make historically and culturally. So I think Russian action opened a space for this, and then in the end, probably misplaced hopes were expressed or could be mobilized. But this, my emphasis was on the fact it happens kind of after the event, after Russia moves in and it becomes a possibility. So while we can never know exactly how many people in Crimea wanted this, but nevertheless there was support for it once it became a possibility. But if it was majority support, definitely not 90%. But if a majority under different conditions would have voted at this moment for it, we don't know. But there was, once the possibility was there, some support that we definitely have to say. And that, I think, is in parts a reflection of a disappointment with development also in Crimea. It was one of the regions that were least also socioeconomically developed. So a sense of neglect by Kyiv also plays a part in this.
Thank you very much. And perhaps I'll turn to the questions in the chat. One of them is very long. You can probably see it as well. It's about the role of academics and academic community in changing the myth of the Russian Crimea. Do you think academics have a role to play in that? And if so, in what way? And then another question is about whether Crimea will ever potentially be Ukrainian again. So we're asking you to predict the future here, but perhaps you could speculate a little bit on that.
Yes, I mean, on the first question about the toponymy of Crimea, and I think that's a really important topic, and that's why I at least in kind of briefly touched on it. And when I did my research on Crimea in the 1990s, and then also did some of historical research, I was really struck by how deeply ingrained the Crimean Tatar names of mountains, of other landscape features were, and the myths that go with it, the Crimean Tatar myths, they were present. And there had been attempts in Tsarist Russia, but also in the Soviet Union, to replace some of them. Some have double names. They also have other names in Russian, sometimes referring to the same legends, sometimes to others. But nevertheless, I thought it was remarkable that after basically en masse deportation of an entire people, these cultural markers, they live on. So whatever a system, a regime does, it could not eradicate this entirely from public memory. And that with the return of the Crimean Tatars, this was of course revived and is even more prominent. This does not stop Russia, also not today, from downplaying or ignoring, replacing these place names. But judging by what happened in the Soviet period, I would think that is nevertheless not possible, and they will live on and they can be revived at any moment, even more so. But I think, and the question is also about the responsibility of academics, and I see it partly in this, that one looks at, I mean, it's not really possible in a 1-hour lecture maybe, but to look at different periods in Crimea's history, but also to understand why certain identities, and the Crimean Tatar one in particular, is so strongly tied to this territory. So that puts up a different, a very important corrective to very widespread Russian presentations of their claims to this territory. So I think that is part of is also part of an academic duty, and also preserves therefore the memory of what these places were called in different periods. But probably I would derive most optimism from the fact that it proved impossible to eradicate these names before, and these references. And the Crimean Tatars themselves, even if some of them have left Crimea again, and some have moved sort of twice in their lifetime by force, they also are extremely active in maintaining that notion of Crimea being their homeland wherever they are based. So, but it's an important question about academic responsibility in times of annexations, war, deportation, and so on. So I think that is part of it, and that's why I also find it important to talk about these issues now. The question about will Crimea ever return to Ukraine, and before February 24th, I always said to that question, it can return after Putin or once Russia has changed. I do not see how before that issue on the Russian side can be opened up. So the important thing then was, and that's what Ukraine engaged in, to keep the issue on the agenda, to make sure internationally it's always kind of said again and again that it's not recognized, but to actually redo or undo this would have to, I think, come from within Russia and from within the region. And the best bet was always once Ukraine becomes overall such a popular place and thriving place, also economically, that maybe there could be also more of a push to reopen this, because the population really wants to be located in Ukraine. But that was already a very perhaps optimistic interpretation of what could happen. But I think now we're in a different context again. And as you know, in the earlier part of the war, Ukraine tried to negotiate and enter negotiations, and offered, in a way, quite a lot, offered negotiations over the current territories which are moving between Russian and Ukrainian control, or are currently under Russian control, but actually bracketing Crimea and even bracketing the parts of the Donbass that were not controlled by Kiev. So that meant that the time horizon, even officially from the Ukrainian end, was prolonged. And then, but I think step by step, I sense that is no longer the line of the Ukrainian government. Zelensky then said it could be parked for 15 years, and then one would have to negotiate it again, the status. And now the sentiment seems to be we can't negotiate over any part of the Ukrainian territory. But nevertheless, it is hard for me at the moment. I would like it, but it's hard for me to imagine that Crimea, that Ukraine will in the foreseeable future really control Crimea again. I mean, the Donbass is a different issue still, I think, and there's more in flux. But at the moment, we don't even know yet if Russia will withdraw from parts of this land corridor, if that would be the outcome of the war. So I think while that is in flux, I personally find it hard to imagine that also this war will change the dynamics in a way that Crimea will return soon. So it will really change. It could only change once there is systemic change in Russia, and that seems at the moment a long way off.
Thank you. Do we have any final questions from the audience? And if not, I will perhaps ask my own question. It really struck me what you said about this survey about belonging and home, what I call home. And it reminded me of late 19th century, early 20th century pronouncements about belonging that we saw in East Central Europe as well, whereby there was nationalist campaigning going on, trying to convince people that they should subscribe to one nationality or another, but they simply said that, no, we are from here. And I was wondering whether this data or this evidence tells us something also about academic research on Crimea. Could Crimea be used perhaps as a useful case study to look beyond the national approach?
I suppose yes and no. And in my book, I write a lot about these dynamics in the multi-ethnic settings, where you have a lot of, it looks clear-cut, but then there are a lot of cross-cutting cleavages, as I would say, as a political scientist. So I think it has, it tells us a lot. And in the period I only touched on briefly now, in the early 90s, it was very pronounced that there was across these different groups, however they were either ethnically defined or by language, because most Ukrainians were those who identify as ethnic Ukrainians, although those notions are all in flux as well, but they are also predominantly Russian speakers, so maybe it's more kind of sometimes a language identity. Then also Crimean Tatars, when they returned from their places of deportation, mostly spoke Russian and have revived Crimean Tatar since then. So a lot of these things don't, if you look closely, and I think therefore it's almost like a lab-like setting of what multi-ethnicity as a result of very different historical experiences brings out, and what gets politically mobilized and what doesn't. And ultimately also in the early 90s, this Russian movement in Crimea basically didn't last very long because it never addressed economic issues, and the population in the early 90s was really focused also on that, and it was a region left behind even at that point. So you can see how then nationalism didn't win in terms of the arguments, but something else that was seen as addressing some of the issues that mattered in everyday life. So I think in that sense, yes, and there's definitely this historical parallel with identifying with the place where I live, whatever's happening else, whatever happens around me, or whatever history and borders move across me, I think is a example from Central Europe. And there was in that period, I'm not so sure what it means today, but in the post-Soviet period, there was a strong notion of a Crimean identity. And although it was filled with different elements and different perspectives, but when you ask people, that was actually something that seemed to unite more than it divided, although there were also many dividing issues, if that makes any sense now in this short form. But this being here and being Crimean had a historical ring to it and could be filled and had a more inclusive touch to it. When we asked this in 2017, people still expressed very strongly that they are Krimchanits, so the Crimean, there's a term for that. But they also pointed to more divisions along ethnic lines than I had picked up in the early 90s. So that notion still exists, but it maybe has become smaller, basically me and where I live. And that Crimean identity that was, I think, a strong factor in the 1990s and the conflict diffusing issue seems to have changed and is maybe really interpreted differently by different groups.
Thank you very much for this elaborate answer. If we don't have any more questions from the audience, I would like to thank you very much, Professor Sasse, for being with us tonight. We really enjoyed your talk, and I'm sure most of us will now look at your work more closely and read more of your research. Thank you very much again, and we hope to see you sometime in person here in Amsterdam. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Thank you.